the community so they can call in and listen when they are free to do so, because not every 11 o'clock, I guess, is a pretty busy time for golfers and tennis players and etc. So anyway, everybody will have the opportunity to hear this presentation. I guess we can post this pretty much soon after, can't we?
It only takes, depending on how long it lasts, it only takes a couple hours to process.
Okay, great. Okay, well, let's get started. I would like to thank everyone for joining us. Good morning to you all. I also have to thank Bud Zwiebel for introducing me to Anna. Bud told me how impressed he was with the presentation Dr. Puzskin-Chevlin made at his club, and suggested I extend an invitation to her to speak to us on a subject which should be very close to our hearts here at AP. Global warming, sea levels rising, and increasing frequency of coastal storms are things we all need to be concerned about, not least when you are surrounded by water like we are. As mentioned in the notice of this presentation, Dr. Anna, as I'm going to call her because it's a little easier, is Regional Director of Growing Climate Solutions, Path to Positive Southwest Florida. It's a joint initiative of Community Foundation of Collier County, Southwest Florida Community Foundation, Florida Gulf Coast University, and the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. Anna, as you may have heard earlier, is basing herself at the Conservancy here in Naples. An urban planner with over 35 years of experience, Anna was also a senior research fellow and visiting scholar at Florida Atlantic and Lynn University, and has published numerous articles on climate resiliency and coastal development. So without further ado, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Anna Puzskin-Chevlin. Take it away, Anna.
Well, thank you, Pamela, for that gracious introduction. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for carving out time on St. Paddy's Day to talk about climate change. I really do appreciate that. Just so that you know, this presentation runs about 40 minutes or so, and I will be able to answer questions. Since we're on a Zoom platform, if you're in the audience, I ask that you mute your mic, and when we finish, we'll try to take some questions and answers and stuff. So let's start with where we are today. I mean, it has been about a year since COVID radically changed our lives. And some of the things that we've noticed is that many of us are working from home, like me today. 33% of the US workforce is actually working remote during COVID, and another 25% approximately work remotely at least some of the time. And also during this past year, a huge number of us have done home renovation and improvement projects. In fact, Business Wire reported that 57% of American homeowners have engaged in some kind of home improvement project between last March and now. And another interesting trend is that when COVID hit, many of us started planting gardens and working outdoors and growing vegetables, partially out of concern that maybe the food supply would be challenged. Miracle Grow, Scott's that produces Miracle Grow, noticed a 36% increase in the number of people requesting seeds and buying fertilizer. So these changes actually took a huge bite out of our greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions last year plunged 10%. And what we're talking about is that if we could actually sustain that trend while doing a robust economic recovery, that would put the United States sort of in a trajectory to meet the major goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So one of the things we have to think about is how we can change things in our lifestyle to encourage those emission reductions while at the same time doing the business recovery and employment growth that we need to return to normalcy. So in today's discussion, I frame that so that we'll get back to those three things toward the end. I'm going to talk about, a brief summary of rising greenhouse gas emissions and what's happening. Then what are the impacts of those emissions? Sea level rise, more stronger hurricanes, increased precipitation at times, and then drought at other times, and more heat. And we'll turn the subject from the impacts to what we can do to reduce those emissions and adapt to those changes, which are projected to happen anyway, even if we were to curtail our emissions almost immediately. So what can you do? What are the practical things that as an audience member, you can do day to day? And finally, I'll take some questions and maybe actually provide you some answers. So I often start at the very beginning because for many of us, it's been a really long time since we took earth science, and even the word greenhouse, gas emissions and effect are a little strange or not 100% comfortable. So this is a chart or a graphic put out by NOAA that's very explanatory. We have the sun that emits, electromagnetic radiation or rays that come through space and travel toward the earth. And many of those rays bounce off the Earth's atmosphere and go back into outer space. Some of those rays come through the atmosphere, hit the Earth and a reflective surface like ice or snow, a white or light colored surface, and also bounce back out through the atmosphere. And then some actually go through the atmosphere and get absorbed into the Earth or into pavement, into darker colors. And they get re-emitted as infrared heat. The wavelength slows down and we get heat waves. Some of those are able to escape the atmosphere, but the majority of which get trapped in the atmosphere. And that keeps the Earth warm and toasty, comfortable for human life. And that's what we call the greenhouse effect. The fact that the rays get trapped in the Earth's atmosphere and keep us warm. The problem is that this atmosphere is like a blanket and it's made to or calibrated for a certain temperature range. If we change the gases in this atmosphere, it's like putting a warmer blanket on. We trap more heat and it gets warmer or global warming. So why is that happening? Why are we changing the composition of the atmosphere? Well, as we've moved from this type of transportation to this type of transportation with emissions coming out of those tailpipes, as we've moved energy from windmills or water mills in the early days of the weaving and fabrics industry to emissions produced by fossil fuels that are burned, as we've changed our agricultural practices from horse and mule powered to mass ag that is then shipped long distances, we have changed that composition. We have burned fossil fuels and emitted more methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2. And this chart actually shows over, let's say, 2,000 years that we were relatively steady until the dawn of the 20th century, where the concentration of these gases has risen sharply. Now, how sharply is this and how much of an aberration is it? Well, on the left-hand side, you see that, the CO2 levels had been under 300 parts per million for over the past 300 years. But here's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution around the mid 1800s. And this is where you start to see the trend going up. And as we've increased and we've modernized our society, we've gone up from, let's say, 315 parts per million in the 50s to about 409 parts per million in 2018. And in 2019, it was already 411 parts per million. And so, well, how much is that? Well, now look at the chart on the right. This is over hundreds of thousands of years. And yes, people say, well, greenhouse gases have changed all throughout the history of the Earth. And here you see it. Here's the concentration of CO2, and it has gone up and down over the course of hundreds of thousands of years. But look where we are today. Nowhere in the time that we or humans have inhabited the Earth have we ever been at 411 parts per million. And that is changing the climate radically over the next, let's say, 100 or 200 years. So what can we anticipate? There are many changes, but we're going to talk primarily about 4: sea level rise, coastal storms, changes in precipitation patterns, and heat waves. So where is most of that warming happening? All those rays? About 90% of that heat has been going into the ocean, because the ocean is a darker color, it's blue, and it covers about 70% of the surface of the earth. So much of that electromagnetic radiation has been absorbed in the oceans, and the oceans are getting warmer. Likewise, the amount of CO2 that's been emitted has also been sequestered in the oceans. As the waves fold air into the water, some of that CO2 has been absorbed into the oceans. And that has led to an increased acidity in the oceans and warming temperatures that have impacted the corals. That's a whole discussion I can have on another day. But I think what's most relevant to us, especially people at Admiralty Point, is that we have sea level rise. And that's simply a function of physics. As the ocean gets warmer, the water expands. Remember that beaker experiment? You put a Bunsen burner under a volume of water, and as the temperature goes up, the volume of water expands. Same thing's happening in the ocean. And we've also gotten a lot of polar ice cap melt. As temperatures have gotten warmer, the glaciers in both poles, Antarctica and Greenland and the North Pole, have decreased in size. We've been losing about 10% of that ice every decade. And what that does is, not only does it add water to the system, go back to that first slide I showed you. It creates a feedback loop, because we need those polar ice caps to reflect some of that solar radiation. As we lose that ice, more of that solar radiation gets absorbed in the permafrost, and then that starts to melt, because that's a brown color. And that permafrost has a lot of CO2 that's been frozen in it, and it emits that more CO2. So we're in actually a really bad feedback loop as we lose that ice. How severe is that? Let me just put it into perspective in one moment in time. This is a picture from a satellite picture of Eagle Island in Antarctica. And last February, about a year ago, there was a 9-day heat wave in Antarctica. It was 64 degrees in Antarctica in February. That was the same temperature it was in LA. And over those 9 days, they lost about 20% of the ice off of that particular island. So altogether, we have a sort of feedback loop that's causing sea level rise. How much? Well, the sea level rise has already risen about 8 inches since 1950, and that rate is accelerating. So over the past decade, we've been gaining about an inch of sea level rise every 3 years or so. So what does that mean? In 2030, in about another 9 to 10 years, we will see about 9 to 15 inches of sea level rise over this 2,000-year base. And by 2040, that could be a foot to almost 2 feet of sea level rise in this area in the next 20 years or so. And that's pretty significant. Now, it happens gradually and you don't see it. So what does that look like? I tried to visualize it using a tool that NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, has created, called the Sea Level Rise Viewer. And I encourage you to go onto that website. It's available to the public. You can actually plug in your address and see where the sea levels are going to be based on different projection scenarios and different points in time. So I picked the intermediate high. You see that's highlighted here. And by 2030, all of the areas in blue will experience periodic to full-time inundation. So the 10,000 island area in the southern part of Collier County will experience a lot of flooding. And so will some of these coastal areas by the ravines, or the river areas and the low-lying areas around the Gordon River. And by 2050, you can see that creeps further inland, and there's more of this darker blue. So the inundation will get deeper. So we can anticipate periodic effects, and this will happen regardless of whether it's covered all the time or during the tides. So even if it's not fully inundated, during high tides, there will be inundation. So what does that mean? Well, property values are at risk, a lot of them. In fact, the prediction is that about 26 times a year, absence of a major storm, some areas in Florida will experience flooding. Nearly 100 zip codes in our state have at least 40% of their property tax base at risk from flooding. And Southwest Florida is particularly vulnerable. A study done by Zillow predicted that Naples, Sanibel, and Fort Myers Beach, which have some low-lying areas, ranked 10th, 26th, and 32nd out of all metropolitan areas in the US in terms of the property values at risk. Of course, that's a function of the fact that we have expensive property values, so we rank higher. But that is a real impact on our public revenue. If those property values start to decline, so will the revenue that governments have to address some of these problems. A recent study that came out by the Wharton School of Business predicted that they're already seeing this bubble, this real estate bubble bursting. The number of sales in vulnerable zip codes started falling in around 2013, according to Dr. Benjamin Keys, who is my speaker in the last Climate Compass series. I saw this study and I got him to come and do a presentation. And what's more interesting is that values have actually started to decrease in those vulnerable zip codes about 5% since around 2018, compared to property values in zip codes that are more inland. Another impact of climate are hurricanes. As the warmer temperatures emerge, warmer air holds more moisture. So storms are going to get wetter. For every 1.7 degrees of temperature increase, we get about 7% more moisture in those storms. And the storms are going to become more powerful. So several studies have come out in scientific journals that look at data looking about 15 years back, and they predict in about 4 landmark studies that the number of powerful category 4 and 5 hurricanes will increase 20 to 30% in the next, say, 40 years. And as the storms get wetter and stronger and the sea levels increase, so will that storm surge. That storm surge will become more powerful and higher up, so it will penetrate further inland when storms do come ashore. And that's the last thing that Florida needs, because look at all the storms that we have had. These are the major hurricanes. Over the past 16 years, we've had 9 major hurricanes totaling about $203 billion. That's B with a billion with a B in damage. And think about what we could do with that kind of money if we didn't have to invest it in rebuilding something that just gets knocked down again. Another issue is even when we don't have a hurricane, the precipitation patterns are going to change. We're going to get wetter wets and drier dries. So we've already started to see some of those. In 2018, there was a storm that brought about 10 to 17 inches of rain to Collier County and flooded roads and parking lots. And when it's dry, we get very long, dry spells. And then we have brush fires. And in between, it impacts all kinds of native wildlife. You know, when there isn't enough rain, the birds can't wade for food, and it disrupts migration patterns. But most of all, what we care about is flooding. And we will experience more flooding during those strong storms, in part for 3 reasons. One, the soils that we have in Florida are naturally limestone. They have pores, like you see in this picture, like a sponge. But once those little holes and crevices get full, there isn't any more absorption. So then the water just puddles on the surface. 2, we wouldn't have been able to build on any of this swampland had we not created the canals that the Army Corps of Engineers did at the turn of the last century. And those canal systems only have so much capacity. They're gravity fed, and they work with these control structures. The control structures work in that they close the structure, it rains, one side drains into the landward side. And then when the water accumulates, you raise the coastal structure and the water comes over to the ocean side and drains out. But as sea level rise increases, the ocean side may be higher than the land side during high tide. Then you can't drain the landward side after a storm, and you get this scenario where the canals flood. and they flood property adjacent to that. Finally, even the simple stormwater drain systems are dumping water into those canals. And if those canals get full, then this outfall gets covered and that water has nowhere to go. The water goes back up the other side of the tube
Yes.
and then floods this side of the parking lot. So for these reasons, flooding will not just happen in coastal areas like where you live, it will happen inland. And during those rainstorms, that flooding contributes to degraded water quality. So a strong rain will push a lot of fertilizer and nutrient into those canal systems, sort of prompting those harmful algal blooms that then go out to the Gulf and ruin our beaches, our health, our tourism industry. And even if we can control that, we still have homes on septic systems, old septic systems. They're not used to that level of water. You pond the water on top of an old septic system, and some of that bacteria percolates up to the top, and then you have kind of a sewer mess. The third impact that a lot of people don't focus on is the heat. And this area, particularly Southwest Florida, is prone to heat. In fact, the number of danger days will increase over time. So in around 2000, we had around 26 of these heat index days. By heat index, it's not just the temperature, it's temperature plus humidity, days where it feels like 105 degrees. But over time, in the next, let's say, 30 years, the number of days with that heat index might go up to about half the year, 157 days. We're particularly vulnerable. Fort Myers, Naples, Punta Gorda rank 5th, 6th, and 8th in the United States in terms of the number of days where we might experience those levels of heat. And that is a significant impact on our economy. I mean, snowbirds are not necessarily going to come down early in November or stay late if those number of heat days increase. In fact, people who live here now year round may leave in the summer and go north more and stay longer because one, the northern latitudes are not going to be as cold, and who wants to be down here with those hurricanes and that heat temperature? So how are the businesses that have flourished in the past 30 years going to survive when all of those spending dollars are moving northward during, extended periods of the year? And if the economic argument isn't strong enough, we have to talk about the health impacts. Hotter temperatures increase dehydration and heat stroke, cardiovascular instances increase, we get more insects and birds that can carry diseases like dengue. Heat also contributes to poor air quality, more ground level ozone, and people with asthma have more respiratory distress and more asthma incidences. It particularly impacts, elderly people and children. Communities of color are strongly impacted by asthma and high heat temperature, and outdoor workers, the people mowing your lawn, the people fixing those roads, they're not going to be able to work during the heat, the hottest part of the day. So we really have to think about how we're going to address this. So what can we do? To me, and part of what Growing Climate Solutions about is that the solutions really represent opportunities. So for a moment, I'll take a pause and tell you a little bit about Growing Climate Solutions. Pamela mentioned that we are funded by 4 very highly respected partners in the region, the 2 community foundations, the university, and the Conservancy. And my goal is to increase climate literacy. The more people understand what's at stake and what we can do, the more this discussion gets depoliticized. This isn't a discussion of red and blue. This is a discussion of science and green. So one of the things we talk about is increasing climate literacy, stressing the importance of protecting our natural assets as preventative. 2 or 3, encouraging community leaders, people like yourselves, people like Pamela, who sits on a board, or leaders of your community organizations, to speak up, to talk about this with your elected officials so that they understand the importance of some of the policy decisions they're going to make, and to enhance prosperity and health in our community. So we want to increase the visibility of good climate action and engage more people to do that. What's beneficial is that we already have a lot of popular support. So when we talk about solutions, We can break them down, let's say, into two large groups. There's mitigation, things that we can do to stop those greenhouse gases. And about 87% of the population here in Southwest Florida believes that they can personally do something to reduce those kind of pollutants. And even an equal number believe that they should take some action. The other side is the adaptation. Okay, so if we can't control the greenhouse gas emissions and we know that these impacts are going to happen, what can we do to not make those impacts so severe? And there's very, very strong support for the fact that communities need to prepare for those floods and those droughts and that sea level rise. 84% of our citizens believe that it's time to start investing in those preparations, those adaptations. And 67%, a full 2/3, believe that the government needs to be involved in protecting us and making some of those investments. Where should those investments be made? So now I'm going to turn the discussion to addressing the drivers, the mitigation pieces, and the adaptations. And we'll go back and forth. So to figure out where to put our money, because we can't put it everywhere, it's a scarce resource, let's see where the biggest bang for the buck would come from. Excuse me a moment. So when we look at the greenhouse gas emissions for the state of Florida, 45% of those emissions come from the transportation sector. And another 43% come from the way we produce electricity, natural gas, fossil fuel. Another portion that we'll address today is a little bit about agriculture and food systems. And if you notice, these are exactly the things that COVID was addressing. Transportation, in terms of the fact that we're not commuting as much. The way we use electricity is part of the way we build our environment to conserve energy, and food, the kind of things we started to grow. So it's interesting that there's a correlation there. So what can we do in terms of energy? Well, the average American produces about 50,000 pounds of CO2. 20% of their total every year is simply from driving their gasoline powered cars. So one of the first things we can do is start really purchasing electric and hybrid vehicles. That will help a lot in the tailpipe emissions. And even if you're not ready to purchase one of those cars, conserving fuel is a really important first step. It can be simple things like don't drive your golf carts around, your golf clubs around in your trunk. They're heavy and they reduce your fuel efficiency. Keep your car tuned up, keep the tire pressure up. There are simple things like that, to more things that require more planning, like going and planning your trips out shopping so that you go out once instead of multiple times, or even just walking and biking to destinations. Walking and biking is really healthy. One of the interesting things I learned is that the electric bike market is poised for huge growth. They have seen 23% growth in the use of electric bikes, and they anticipate 32% growth per year. If I had a penny stock, I would look at that. But to really encourage people to bike and walk, we have to look at the way we build our streets and our built environment. We don't build streets for multimodal transportation. We need to start building streets, not just for cars, but for people and bicyclists and other types of mobility. So here's a picture of what they call a complete street. Here they have taken some of the lanes that used to be dedicated for cars, put parking in to buffer it, and built a bike lane that is protected from the cars. They've also widened the streets, making it more attractive for pedestrians. And notice that these intersections are bulbed out. That slows the turns of cars and makes it safer for pedestrians. When you do it on both sides, it narrows the street width so that pedestrians can comfortably walk across the street in one traffic signal. So all of these things make a built environment that is more conducive to multimodal transportation. So these are the mitigating impacts. But even until we get there, we're going to have to elevate some of the roadways that we already have. Some of that water is going to flood the roads. So elevating the roads is going to be a big investment. The Keys are already trying to tackle this, and it's not easy because elevating about a half a mile of road in the Keys costs $3 million. $3 million. You can't, they have 314 miles of roadway that they need to elevate. How could they possibly get enough money? And which roads will they prioritize? Is it a half a mile that services $9, $8 million homes? Or is it another, piece of roadway that services maybe 50 lower income homes? These are going to be political battles, and they're hard fought. So there are going to be a lot of discussions with political leaders, and we need public participation in these decisions. Going back to the built environment, this density issue is really important. So most of us think of this as our ideal single family retirement Florida home. But when you live at this density, these single family homes, people who own these homes drive about 15,000 miles a year. When you start building denser housing, like townhouse structure like this, and you infill that into areas that are already built, these homeowners drive about half as many miles because they're just closer to shopping and friends and other destinations. And we have plenty of opportunity to infill the areas that have already been developed. Here's a picture of an old shopping center. And what we see here is mostly a sea of parking. And if we were to introduce a mixed use development and fill in some of this, create structured parking, we would create a denser, more vibrant, more urban community. I'm not saying urban like New York City. I'm saying urban like town. And that would reduce the number of miles and the amount of energy that we use, contributing to that mitigating impact. Now, we can't do that everywhere. So in areas that are not prone to that, we're going to have to adapt. And that means when you're close to the shore, we're going to have to build further back. These homes are going to get washed away. We're going to need to push them back. There are old historic structures that are built along the waterfront. We want to keep them. We will have to pick them up and actually move them. And there is a whole industry that actually does this. It's really cool. I have seen it happen with some historic homes in Delray Beach. They have moved them to infill locations. For people like the folks that live along Gulf Shore Road, we're going to have to look at elevating the base, the habitable floors, elevating structures so that the first 2 floors are floodproof. They're either parking or they're just space, open space that can be used for, temporary events, and elevating that ground floor up and above. And where possible, gaining back as much open space as possible, because that open space is a buffer. It takes a beating when the storm comes across. It also absorbs a lot of water, prevents a lot of flooding. So for you guys, and I know you're facing this, one of the ways to be safe from those storms is looking at what we've always done in Florida, keeping our beaches and dunes healthy, rebuilding eroding dunes and building them up and planting them so that sand stays put. And on the bay side, it's preserving those mangroves. In fact, during Hurricane Irma, they found that areas that were protected by mangroves had 25% less property damage in the areas behind them. Those mangroves, prevented about $1 million worth of damage during that storm. And yet people constantly want to cut them down for a view. We can no longer afford that. We have to preserve the mangroves and actually encourage them. As sea levels rise, those mangroves will have to migrate landward. So we have to take up some space as open space to allow that migration. On the other side, we have to figure out what to do with our seawalls. And here's a picture of Delray Beach. There's a seawall here and it's been breached. Now you see the seawall. It's not that it's been topped over. As the tide came up, the pressure of the water came up underneath the seawall and flooded the street. And this will continue to happen more and more frequently as tides go up. So when we look at seawalls, we're going to have to push them back from the waterfront and preferably plant mangroves in front. Not only does that buffer the waves and protect the structure of the engineering, it also provides habitat for small fish. One of the solutions is what they call a living shoreline, pictured here below. It's a riprap stone structure out in the water, but not too deep, with a lot of natural plantings behind it. several feet. And this allows the water to migrate inland, but very gently and not cause as much erosion. For those strong rains, we're going to have more intensive water retention. So the old ponds or retention areas may have to be deeper. Here's one that's been topped over. When we build parking lots, we need to have a different kind of drainage. Those green areas are not just pretty, they're there to soak up the water from the parking lot and let it penetrate and go down back into the earth. And we're going to have to build pumps. The city of Miami floated a bond for $500 million to be able to build the kind of pumping infrastructure to keep certain areas dry. And that is an expense. It's a public expense. Do you think your city council person will easily vote for that? They're scared not to get elected. So what they need to know is that the public supports this kind of investment, because without that, you're going to lose that property value. You won't be able to access certain homes and buildings. So this is where, my job is to teach and to educate, so that instead of having people say, no, we shouldn't spend money on that, before you make that conclusion to that particular location, you have to know what's at stake, and what other possible solutions there are. So another thing we promote is putting in a lot of trees. Planting trees is one of those natural assets that really helps. One, trees provide shade. So as temperatures get warmer in our region, areas that are shaded are about 10 degrees cooler. It's much easier to walk in the shade for a stroll than it is when there's only a palm tree and very little shade. Two, trees take carbon dioxide out of the air. It's not foolproof, but it does sequester CO2. But most importantly, trees also improve the air quality and the water quality. They slow down the root system, allows water to penetrate and drain into the aquifer. And even the root system slows down the drainage of water so that it goes through more earth and it's cleaner when it gets absorbed. And finally, the best part is that trees often improve property values. Tree-lined streets are known to have about 10% higher property values than those with less landscaping. In terms of your personal, actions, well, many of us have already converted to LED, but we can also adjust the temperature of our air conditioning, make sure those systems are running efficiently. And when you don't need to, try the ceiling fan. Using a ceiling fan produces about 3 to 4 degrees cooler temperatures in that room. It feels that way, even though the temperature may be the same temperature, the motion creates that feeling of 3 degrees cooler, and it reduces your energy consumption by 30%. We can also increase the insulation. So when we see people fixing up their homes during COVID, how many of them are doing energy efficiency versus countertops and kitchens? We should invest our money where it's going to make a difference. Excuse me. One moment, please. I'm sorry. Another approach is to create shading and cool roofs. As we do our outdoor landscaping, include canopy areas. They're going to become critical to being able to enjoy the outdoors in the future. Solar is another piece of the equation, how we produce energy. So the cost of solar has really dropped to about $3 a watt, 65% over the past decade. For a condominium like Admiralty Point, it's hard to install solar everywhere, but you can certainly, if you have common roof areas, introduce enough solar for metering your common areas. That means your community room, the parking lot, lobby areas. That will reduce your common area maintenance quite a bit. For those individual condo owners, they can subscribe to an FPL program called Solar Together. It's a subscription program where you're buying solar energy that's off-site in a solar field. So those are solutions, but we have to look at it in a more policy-oriented way as well. About 42% of the rooftops in our country that could put solar are on low and moderate income housing. Those homeowners can't afford the upfront investment, and nor can they benefit from the tax benefit that you get from putting solar, and that tax benefit's critical to making solar's return on investment really worth it. So we're not incentivizing all the solar that we could. We need to create solar programs that reduce the upfront costs instead of making it a tax abatement, because nonprofits like churches or schools, they can't benefit from they're a nonprofit. They have no tax implication. So they lose that 26% tax credit. It's very hard for them to make solar economically feasible. Even when we can't get to solar, look at the roofs. Remember that reflectivity that we talked about? If we're losing all this ice and snow, at least our urban areas shouldn't be so dark. So here in New York City, they painted about 7 million square feet of rooftops with a white surface, and it lowered temperatures about 5 degrees. And in LA, they tried a similar experiment with roads. They painted their roads a lighter color and found that the roads and the areas around the road were about 7 degrees cooler than in surrounding neighborhoods that didn't paint. That's a pretty interesting experiment. And finally, I'm going to round this out with something that's really easy to do, which is the kind of food you eat. Food systems are about 9% of the greenhouse gases emitted in the US, the ag sector. And about 4% of that 9% comes from livestock, from beef. So people often say, eat less beef and eat more plants. And I'm like, well, why is that exactly? And I will hope to explain that to you. Not that we're all going to become vegetarian. I'm the daughter of Argentinians. If anybody eats beef, I eat quite a bit of beef. But reducing the amount of beef is equally important to just becoming, a vegan or a vegetarian, even reducing it 1 day a week. So why is it so important? Cattle are the #1 source of greenhouse gases worldwide. Each cow produces about 220 pounds of methane from belching and farting. And methane is a really potent greenhouse gas, about 34% more potent than even carbon dioxide. And cows, to grow beef, takes a lot of resources. So cows require about 1,800 gallons of water to produce a pound of chuck. Compare that to about 215 gallons of water for soybean plants. As we need more water and more land for them to graze in other countries like Brazil and Argentina and developing nations, they deforest their green trees to allow for more grazing space. So we're losing some of those carbon, sequestration areas. And to put it into real perspective, beef is about the worst one. So if you measure the amount of feed it takes to make a pound of beef, it's 25 pounds of feed for 1 pound of beef. Compare that to chicken, that takes about 4.5 pounds of feed for a pound of chicken. So the more we reduce beef, the less we have to grow food to feed the cattle, the more energy we save, the less methane we produce. So as we change to a more plant slant diet, we're really going to reduce and mitigate greenhouse gases. Also, it's just healthy for you. It's healthy for your heart, healthy for your kidneys. It supports local farmers, especially here in Florida. It's less expensive. And as we convert our agricultural practices, we can sequester more carbon, the more regenerative we make that agriculture. And if you're not willing to change your diet, well, at least reduce the amount of waste. It's unbelievable, but in the US, about 1/3 of the food we produce does not make it from the farm to your fork. We waste about 1/3 of the food we produce. That's about $2,000 worth per family. So, having a lavish brunch and showing a lot of display and then finding all of that food in the trash is really, very passé. Produce and use the amount of food you're going to consume. Just showing excess is not the way we should show our affluence, our wealth, or our prosperity anymore. So what are the next steps that I ask of you? After this presentation, you will be confronted with hundreds of choices every day. Every day, you will make energy choices. You will use your water, either turn off that faucet when you're washing a dish or brushing your teeth, or take a shorter shower. You will get in your car or decide to pump up your bike and take it to the beach instead. You will go food shopping at Publix or at Fresh Market or at Whole Foods and make a decision whether you're going to buy organic or not, and whether you're going to buy fish or meat, and whether that fish is going to be wild caught. What we ask of you is make your choices sustainable. Also, if you find this topic intriguing, join Growing Climate Solutions electronically. Go to the website, growingclimatesolutions.org, and sign up at least for the newsletter, and you'll learn a little bit in each newsletter about this topic. And follow us on social media, Facebook or Twitter, because we post all kinds of interesting tips. You get a dialogue going with other people, and you see and learn more new things. And by posting that you participated, you will encourage your friends who are not here today to maybe take interest in this topic. So talk to your neighbors and friends. When you're playing bridge, when you're out on the golf course, maybe raise the question about how much fertilizer goes into that golf course to keep those greens green, or how do they keep the water from accumulating algae? Is it copper sulfite, or are they planting around it? Get engaged. You'll find a million different ways to advance this topic. And if you really, get involved, possibly publish something, send a letter to the editor, send something to your newsletter, right in your condominium, and communicate with your elected officials. Go to those meetings. So the takeaways from today, and I know I've run a little long, is that climate is not an environmental issue, it's a societal issue. It affects all aspects of our society. And we have to both mitigate those greenhouse gases as well as adapt to the impacts. And we want to make sure that as we adapt, those restorations are equitable to all people. We have to think long-term, but we can't wait. We can't wait until the water is 2 feet higher. We have to act in the present. And talking about it engages others and leads to those kind of actions. So just because we don't know exactly when it's going to happen is not an excuse for inaction. It starts today, little by little. We don't need to do anything drastic. Just tweak your daily habits a little at a time. And if we do it together, we're going to make an impact. So on that note, I'll open it up to any questions and stop sharing my screen.
And that is on the Moorings Bay Citizens Advisory agenda, as it were, but it's very difficult because if you consider the depth and the tidal differentiation in the bay, it's moving your seawall back and planting mangroves it's not an easy thing to do. But it is being looked at by the city, but then they don't have a large control of all the private seawalls on the bay.
Understand, yeah.
But even the seawalls over time will need to be looked at in terms of their adequacy. Many of them are old and they're starting to crumble, and some of them may not be tall enough in the future. So as those issues, as the condominiums and private homeowners start to invest in rebuilding or armoring their seawall, there could be other solutions that create more biodiversity. Rather than build the seawall exactly the way it was, you can do a hybrid structure. The city of West Palm Beach did a project where they built a living shoreline in front of their seawall, filled it with plantings, and it protected the old seawall, and it created an area that periodically flooded, but also protected the landward side. I'll see if I can find a picture of it and send it to you, Pamela. So there are new technologies to consider. It's expensive. And it's more expensive to do the right thing. And condominiums are often reluctant to take the extra dollars and do the more expensive project. But it's really critically important for, filtration of water, for little fishies to have a nursery to grow. We have to sort of rebuild that ecosystem. And in the long run, it helps protect the investment of the seawall itself.
I would say that's undoubtedly true.
You know,
One thought about your fertilizer. I often talk about this with homeowners groups that have single family homes. Composting is one of the slides that I took out of this presentation, but because people have an ick factor to composting, and it requires some attention. But if you could organize or possibly explore a composting feature with all of these homeowners, you would produce quite a bit of compost, and compost is naturally rich in nutrients, helps all of your vegetation bases grow beautiful and lush landscaping, and you can reduce your fertilizer use. For a large condominium, you might need a pretty substantial composter, but they're not impossible to acquire. They don't take up a lot of space, and they're not difficult to learn to manage. I mean, a property manager or your landscaping company could get involved in managing it for you. And then you create a closed loop system where at least some of the food that's being consumed ends up in a compost, and that compost is redistributed to the landscaping in your area. There's a golf club in Boca Raton that did that with their clubhouse, and they fertilize all of their greens and all of the landscaping with the compost produced from their dining room at the clubhouse. It's fascinating.
Wow, that's a marvelous idea.
It's a little scary. It sounds very greeny, like macrame, earthy Birkenstock, but it isn't. It can be done. It's not, it takes some research, but it would be incredibly cool to be able to boast something like that. I mean, that would be really a step forward, and you could become a role model for others. There are compost experts. I know one up in Sarasota I could probably connect you with.
I think that that would probably work in homeowners associations. Personally, just a quick thought, I can't imagine where we would put that at this place. And besides that, we already have messes with people that can't figure out how to use the recycling bins properly. So who knows what would wind up. So I see the benefit, I see the real benefit for, those of us who also have private homes somewhere else, to take that under consideration and see what we can do there. I personally, question what could be done here with the condos along the beach. That seems to me to be more problematic. Some sites might have enough space, but when I think about walking around our property, my quick reaction is I have no idea where they would put it and which owners would be willing to do that. But
Well, it's a very good, it's a very interesting thought, and worth looking into. Can't promise anything, but it's definitely worth looking into.
But if I had to say, I think what Ted said was really revealing, that you don't have to, go full compost. If you're struggling just doing recycling, maybe one first step is to just improve the recycling education for your residents. Growing Climate Solutions has a relationship with Waste Management, that carts most of it. They have a recycling expert that I could arrange to do a presentation for you like this, and really explaining to people, hey, pizza boxes don't go in the recycling because they have oil. Just that small educational step. Think about if you could improve the recycling content. That's important, and that's not difficult. So when I do these presentations and we look at, well, composting, that's complicated. We don't really know how to do that. But improving recycling, that's easy. And those are the small steps that we need. If that's something you've identified, reach out to me. I'll connect you with, what's her name? I forgot right now, because I have like 60 partners, but I know the waste management rep, and we can work on just that small thing.
Pam, I think that's something worth considering. My 2 cents again. But
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
Pam, I agree 100%. I have gone into our recycle bins and pulled out plastic bags, which I don't think people realize that you're not supposed to put plastic bags in there. But it really is a problem here, the recycling. We need to educate people on the proper recycling.
We
And
need to
that's
have some
easy.
recycling police.
That's
I'm
great.
one of them.
That's not difficult. That's something that people feel like, you know, I do it, I can do it better. And even I'm sort of like in this business, and even in my own household, I am pulling out plastic film that goes on top of, you know, the Pepsi, the 6-pack of Pepsi. That doesn't go into the recycling. It's
People don't
film.
realize, yeah.
Right.
Realize. And the other issue that we have here are renters. They really don't know the recycling policy for Southwest Florida. You know, they're probably doing what they do up north, and it's not the same. So I think everybody should get a paper stating exactly what should go in and what shouldn't go into the recycle bins. And I mean, literally every time I go down there, I pull plastic bags out or things that are recyclable.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem, and we do need to educate our people better. But
And there are other small things as well. Like I haven't been to your condo, but water conservation is an important piece. 3% of greenhouse gases in the US come from water, from purifying water. We purify a lot of water even to drinking quality and then spread it all over the landscape, right? And how many times do you see the rainbird sprinkling when it's raining in the summer? You know, as those as those sprinklers get worn out and need to be replaced, yes, it's more expensive to invest in a system that has a meter or a gauge, but yes, do it. Conserve that water and get a system that has the, you know, radio communication and doesn't go off right before a rainstorm is coming or right after, right? These little small things. And yes, it's more expensive upfront, but you're going to also save on your irrigation costs. So, you know, making that argument to your condo board to, yes, retool that because you have a lot of landscaping and it's worth it. It's these small little tweaks. We don't go 1,000 miles in one shot. We get there with incremental steps.
I just going back to Sue's question on the fertilizer. I felt that I didn't have the information to hand, but I can assure you, Sue, that our landscapers and our arborists are very strict about following the law or the laws in the state and local regarding application of fertilizer, when and how much. So they do pay attention to it.
Well, and thank you for that, Pam. I'm sure that is true. And I know you've always been on top of that. But I guess my thought would be sometimes we may be following the laws, but maybe that's not quite enough.
I take your point, and one thing I'll just mention very quickly, because I don't want to keep Anna much longer because she's given us so much of her time already. It's just that, and Anna, I'd like your opinion about this. We have trees that drop an inordinate amount of detritus, the Bishovias. I'm talking Bishopswood trees, and the amount of the berries and everything goes straight into our stormwater system, which I believe is really not healthy for the environment, because that empties into our waterways and produces the toxic nutrients that create the algae blooms. Is that accurate or not?
I'm not an arborist and I can't speak to those particular species. I don't think that the deciduous leaves and that end up in the stormwater system really are the key contributing factor to the algal blooms. It's more of the, well, one, the combination of bacteria and the phosphorus levels. That many of those other things get cleared out in the storm drain filter systems and then get composted by the municipal water supply. It really depends on the location. I can't answer that one for sure.
Any other questions for Anna?
No, but I would like to thank Anna. I think you put everything, you just described everything so well, much of what I thought I knew, but you really distilled it to its essence. So thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, there's a lot in this topic. We could, depending on the group, we can talk about, consumption issues. With one of the slides I wanted to include, but realized I was just running late, is in those decisions, there's also investment decisions, socially responsible investing. And that's a big new field and it's emerging now. Companies that do the right thing, put your money in companies that take responsibility for the environment and for social concerns. And it's a big investment. It's a big push now in the financial industry to clean up their act. And there are now funds that support socially responsible companies. That's something I'm looking into personally, even in a small way. It used to be like, well, those companies don't make a good return. I'm retired. I need my return. But really, those funds have been outperforming the market. And so, there are decisions that you make when you throw the Pepsi can in the wrong recycling thing. There are decisions you make when you pick up your financial advisor and you say, hey, yeah, you told me to reallocate. Could you look into an ESG fund? Find me a good ESG fund that's performing. I'd like to put my money and my resources where it counts. Those are important decisions, small incremental steps. But imagine if we all did them, how important and how that really shifts the dialogue. So, I talk about that sometimes. There are decisions you make every day in the kinds of purchases you make. So all I want to do is inspire all of us that we don't have to be, crazy. This isn't a crazy lefty vegan Birkenstock wearing, hippie thing. That image is old. This is you and me, common, ordinary people making good decisions every day. Mature adults, we have wisdom. We can make these sacrifices. And also the fact that you're all here shows you care. Now just vocalize that to people and tell them that you care, because you influence others. You probably have a group of friends who didn't come today. Tell them what you learned. If they think you think it's important, you may convert one of them to think this is important. And that's how we change the norms. And so I leave you with that note. Please engage with me. I'm here as a free resource for the region, and join Growing Climate Solutions. I won't spam you with too much stuff. The newsletter comes out every other month. We send out a monthly education, like, hey, you want to learn about this? There's a webinar here. We send out an occasional email. You'll learn a lot. Maybe you'll meet some cool people. So we would love to have your organization join us.
Well, thank you so much, Anna. It's been very educational listening to your insights, and I'm sure that we will take you up on your offer. And I'd love to be in touch with anybody you'd like to, who could give us more information on.
The recycling person is Stephanie Kissinger. I just remembered the name. Stephanie Kissinger at Waste Management. I will send you, Pamela, her information.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Well, thank you again. And we will say goodbye unless anybody has one more question. Any more questions? Nope, you're done.
Thank you,
Thank you very much.
And have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
St. Patrick's Day, everyone.
Thank you.
And
Thank you. You inspired me.